Sometimes a company can collapse not because of external competitors, but because of internal arrogance. And on a gray Chicago morning, the seeds of that destruction were planted in a glass-enclosed conference room on the 32nd floor of the NovaCore Solutions building. The city skyline was shrouded in a thin haze, like a gray curtain hiding the sun. The streets were bustling with people rushing about, cars flashing their daytime lights, and horns honking. But inside the NovaCore building, the atmosphere was different, silent, formal, and filled with an invisible pressure. The main conference room gleamed to perfection. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the chandelier's light, and black leather chairs were neatly arranged as if positioned for a show. At the head of the table sat a man who was not just the CEO, but the symbol of the company's power, Richard Whitmore. Richard was 55 years old, his hair graying at the sides, but his eyes were sharp as swords. His suits looked expensive, his ties were always impeccable, and his every move exuded an aura of superiority. He was the type of leader who didn't just talk, but commanded the room with his silence. Everyone knew that once Richard spoke, it wasn't a discussion, it was a decision. On the other side of the table, away from the spotlight, sat a young 32-year-old black man, Marcus Johnson, a financial analyst, hardworking and meticulous. From the outside, Marcus might have seemed ordinary. His blue suit was simple, his tie wasn't particularly expensive, and he sat almost at the head of the table. But beneath that exterior, he carried something more valuable than a title: the truth. And that truth would today make him belittled in front of everyone. The presentation began. On the large screen, graphs climbed, million-dollar figures and bombastic words about global expansion filled the room. Richard spoke passionately, explaining NovaCore's plans to invest heavily in Europe. The director's smiles lit up the room as if they were witnessing a dream come true. Marcus stared at the screen, a chill creeping up his spine. For the past 2 weeks, he had buried himself in piles of data. He knew better than anyone else in the room that the beautiful numbers on the screen were a mirage. The European market was saturated. Old competitors were waiting with aggressive strategies. Logistics and operational costs would eat into profits. He looked down at his notes. Row after row of numbers felt like a warning bell. He knew that if he took this course of action, NovaCore would lose at least $10 million in the first year alone. But would anyone listen? Marcus had often felt like a shadow. From the moment he joined NovaCore, he knew how rigid the hierarchy was. Senior executives saw him as little more than a young analyst from a state university, with no connections, no Ivy League prestige. They appreciated his work, but rarely gave him recognition. His ideas were often stolen by other superiors while he remained in the corner. That day in the conference room, that feeling of being belittled reached its peak. As Richard paused, allowing the directors to nod in agreement, Marcus felt something inside him push itself out. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it. The room, which had been filled with applause, suddenly fell silent. All heads turned. Marcus spoke in a calm voice, conveying that, based on his data, the expansion into Europe would potentially incur significant losses. He stated a figure: $10 million. His voice wasn't high, but it was clear, direct, and without hesitation. For a moment, the air in the room seemed to freeze. The directors looked at each other. Some smiled sarcastically. Others raised their eyebrows in surprise. Then, Richard leaned back in his chair. A smile appeared on his lips, a cold smile that needed no words to humiliate him. Half-jokingly, he called Marcus too young, too obsessed with spreadsheets, and lacking a grasp of the big picture. A chuckle erupted from the corner of the room. Some directors shook their heads, others patted the table in agreement with the CEO. It was as if Marcus's words were merely a trivial interruption in a grand performance. Marcus closed his notes slowly. He lowered his head, not wanting to reveal the anger simmering within him. The meeting continued as if he had never spoken. When the meeting ended, the executives filed out, satisfied, discussing the upcoming profits. The sound of leather shoes echoed on the marble floor. The large door closed and the room finally emptied. Marcus remained seated in his chair. His laptop was open, but the screen was blank. He stared at it without really looking. Inside, two emotions were clashing: shame and anger. He knew he was right. Numbers never lie. But truth is not enough in this world, not when those in power deny it. Marcus took a deep breath and stood. He walked out of the room, down a long hallway with glass walls that offered a view of Chicago. Buildings towered outside, streetlights starting to come on, even though it wasn't quite nighttime yet. Richard's face kept appearing in his mind. That dismissive gaze was sharper than 1,000 criticisms. However, beneath the pain, something began to grow. A small flame that hadn't been extinguished, only grew brighter. Marcus knew that allowing the CEO's decision to go ahead would mean allowing the mighty ship Novacor to hit an iceberg. And when that happened, everyone would feel the impact, including himself. If others chose to remain silent, he wouldn't.
That night, Marcus walked home through the chilly Chicago wind. Police sirens could be heard in the distance, street lights dimmed, and the scent of rain lingered in the air. He recalled his childhood on the South Side, his father, a bus driver who worked long days, and his mother, a night nurse who came home tired but always smiling. They never had much money, but they always instilled one thing in him: hard work and honesty. Marcus remembered his mother once saying, "Don't let the world define who you are. Show it by what you do." Those words now felt like an unfulfilled promise. In his small apartment, Marcus opened his laptop again. Spreadsheets awaited him, filled with the market data he had collected. He stared at the numbers with determination. If they wouldn't listen to him, he would let the facts speak louder. This company might only see him as a small-time analyst, but he knew he could be more. And that night, under the dark Chicago sky, Marcus Johnson decided one thing: he wouldn't stay silent. The fire within him was already burning. The days following that big meeting felt like a nightmare to Marcus. Novacor Solutions buzzed with false energy. Every office hallway, every open workspace was filled with optimistic whispers of European glory. Directors passed by beaming, managers busily making expansion plans, and the marketing team was already preparing major campaigns. But beneath the glitz, Marcus saw shadows. He saw numbers that didn't align, market patterns that betrayed the euphoria. He walked among busy coworkers, carrying a stack of analysis papers, feeling like the only sane person in a burning house. At his desk, the computer screen glowed brightly, filled with spreadsheets layered with graphs. Numbers danced before him, but it wasn't the numbers that unsettled him. It was the human attitude that refused to hear the truth. Samantha Lee, the only person who had ever whispered encouragement, paused at his desk one afternoon. She looked at Marcus with serious eyes. "Are you still working on it?" she asked quietly. Marcus simply nodded, his eyes glued to the screen. "Richard has already started pressuring my team. They've been asked to prepare a system prototype for the Berlin branch. Everyone's too busy to ask if this makes sense." Samantha sighed, then added, "If you need data from other divisions, I can help." Marcus turned, a glint of gratitude in his eyes. "I'll contact you later, but please don't be too obvious. They already think I'm the problem." Samantha nodded curtly and left. The workday ended, but Marcus remained at his desk. The clock on the wall struck 9 o'clock, and the office was silent except for the sound of the air conditioner. The lights of Chicago twinkled through the large windows, a reminder that the outside world was still moving, even though he was trapped inside. On the screen, he opened the latest European market report. The graph was down sharply. Profit projections were weak. Then he opened a competitor report. A German fintech giant was about to launch a new, lower-cost product. Novacor, with all its investment, would be a juicy hit. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his face. Exhaustion mixed with frustration. He could have let this all happen, shelved his analysis, and watched the company fall. But that meant the loss of thousands of jobs, including those of small-time workers like himself, ordinary people just looking for a chance. He remembered his father, a bus driver who always left before sunrise. "If you know the right way, don't let a blind man lead you into a pit," his father used to say. Those words cut deep into his heart. Marcus lowered his head to the screen again, his fingers typing furiously. He was composing a new document. Risk Analysis Report, European Expansion. Every page was filled with evidence, graphs, trends, loss figures. He didn't just want to talk. He wanted to carry a weapon into battle. It was 2 a.m. when he finally closed his laptop. From the window, the city lights were starting to dim, with only a few taxis passing by. Marcus knew this was just the beginning.
A few weeks later, Novacor held another internal meeting. This time, it was smaller, with only the major division directors and the CFO, David Clark. Marcus wasn't invited, but he sat in the waiting room outside with the other staff, waiting to be called in if anyone needed data. From behind the half-open meeting door, he could hear Richard's loud voice. "We're signing the Berlin contract next month. This is a golden opportunity. Don't hesitate." David's voice was low, almost reluctant. "But logistics costs are higher than expected. We could lose margin." "Margin is the little guy's problem," Richard interrupted sharply. "We're talking about greatness, not small change." Marcus clenched his fists. He wanted to run in and throw the data in their faces, but he restrained himself. One wrong move could ruin everything. When the meeting ended, David exited with a tense expression. He walked past Marcus, barely looking back, but for a moment, their eyes met. There was hesitation in the CFO's eyes, like someone who knows the truth but is too afraid to say it. A few days later, Marcus received a brief email from David. Just one sentence. "Meet me after office hours, basement parking." Marcus arrived, his heart pounding. In a dim corner of the parking lot, David stood leaning against his black car, his jacket removed. "I saw the report you prepared," David said matter-of-factly. His voice was low, as if the walls would hear. "Those numbers are true. Europe is indeed dangerous." Marcus held his breath. "Then why were you silent in the meeting?" David took a deep breath. "You don't understand the politics here. Richard has been in that chair for 2 decades. He has the board in his pocket. If I openly oppose him, I lose my position, maybe my career." Marcus glared at him. "If we keep quiet, everyone will lose more than their position. They could lose their jobs." David didn't answer, just stared blankly toward the exit. Finally, he said quietly, "Continue your analysis, but be careful. Richard isn't the type to be challenged." Marcus went home that night, his mind reeling. He knew he wasn't alone. There was a gap. The CFO was hesitant, Samantha supportive. Slowly, small cracks began to appear in Richard's fortress. The following days, the Novacor office felt like a silent battlefield. New posters about the future of Europe were plastered on the walls. Strategy meetings were held almost hourly, and the marketing team worked around the clock. Everything seemed busy, but Marcus knew it was just a march toward the abyss. At his desk, he continued to compile evidence. Spreadsheets grew thicker, presentation documents more detailed. He even added an alternative strategy, expansion into South America, which showed the potential for greater profits with lower risk. Samantha often came in quietly, bringing additional data from other divisions. "If anyone finds out I helped, my bonus could be cut," she said one night. Marcus simply replied, "I owe you." Despite the hard work, Marcus felt increasingly isolated.
Coworkers began to distance themselves, as if afraid of being associated with someone who opposed the CEO. Whispers could be heard every time he passed. Suspicious stares pricked his back. But he didn't waver. The pressure only made his resolve stronger. One afternoon, as Marcus emerged from the pantry carrying cheap coffee, he ran into Richard. The CEO paused, staring at him for a moment with a faint smile. "You look busy, Johnson." Marcus tried to keep a neutral face. "Just working as usual, sir." Richard leaned in slightly, his voice low but sharp. "Remember, this company doesn't need heroes. It needs soldiers who know their place." He then walked away, leaving Marcus with trembling hands holding a cup. Those words weren't just a warning, they were a threat. But the threat fueled the fire in Marcus's heart. A few nights later, Marcus was working late alone again. The office was silent, except for the sound of the air conditioner and the hum of neon lights. Outside the window, Chicago glistened with streetlights and tall buildings. Marcus opened his document again. His hands were tired, his eyes bloodshot, but his mind was sharp. He added page after page of evidence, graph after graph. The report was now more than just analysis. It was a weapon. He paused, staring at his reflection on the dark screen. A young analyst, tired, belittled, but determined. He whispered to himself, almost like a vow. Marcus now stood on the brink of confrontation. The CEO was growing more stubborn, the board increasingly blind, but small cracks were already beginning to appear. With each long night, he prepared himself not only to save the company, but also to prove his own worth. And in the cold city of Chicago, the silent war between the undervalued employees and the arrogant CEO was getting closer to an explosion. A few days after the last meeting, rumors began to swirl on the 32nd floor. The directors who had previously obeyed Richard were now whispering more often, staring at piles of reports with exasperation. David Clark, the CFO, sat in his office with his head bowed. Stacks of documents littered the desk. European distribution contracts, tax returns, and vendor documents. His eyes were red from staying up all night. He had just discovered something that made his heart race. Some of the contracts turned out to be illegitimate. The French logistics vendor that Novacor was supposed to be working with was a shell company. Its address was fake, its documents riddled with irregularities. David covered his face with his hands. "Oh my God, this isn't just a miscalculation, this is fraud." That night, in the quiet parking garage, David handed Marcus a stack of photocopies. The neon lights flickered, adding to the thriller-like atmosphere. David whispered, "I think Richard knows the European market is collapsing, but he's pushing this project anyway because there's foul play behind the contract. Billions have already flowed into a fictitious company." Marcus swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he held the documents. "So he deliberately set Novacor up for failure?" "Worse," David replied quietly, "he might enrich himself." Marcus felt a mixture of anger, disgust, and fear. But that fear was quickly replaced by a fire in his chest. "Then we'll get to the bottom of it, right down to the roots." Night after night, Marcus and David worked quietly in the old, rarely used archive room. Samantha helped, hacking into the HR system and downloading copies of old emails. The archive room was dark, the smell of dust mixed with the scent of old paper. Only the light from their laptops illuminated their tired faces. Samantha whispered as she typed rapidly, "I found an email from Richard to one of the vendors. He ordered them to triple logistics prices in exchange for a personal bonus." Marcus clenched his fists. He's selling this company for his own money. David stared at them both, his face pale. If this leaks prematurely, all three of us could be fired. Or worse, our reputations ruined forever. Marcus glared at him. "If we keep quiet, thousands of people will lose their jobs. I can't play blind anymore." On the 32nd floor, the atmosphere in the office had changed drastically. People were becoming more cautious about what they said. There were whispers that some directors had begun asking financial questions to the internal audit team. Richard still appeared confident, but Marcus could see the small cracks in his face. His smile was no longer as serene as before. His voice in the meeting sounded harsher, more defensive, as if he were hiding something. In his heart, Marcus knew. The king was starting to feel his chair being shaken. The day came. An emergency meeting of the board of directors was called. All the directors were present, their faces tense. Richard opened the meeting with a loud voice. "We are on the path to greatness. Let's not let fear rule us." David stood slowly, his voice trembling but clear. "With the board's permission, I must report an important finding. There are serious indications that several European expansion contracts are invalid, and there are suspicious funds flowing into unexplained company accounts." The room suddenly froze. Richard stared at David with a murderous glare. "Clark, you dare accuse me of corruption?" David almost backed away, but Marcus stood up. "We have proof. Emails, documents, even transaction records. This isn't about expansion anymore. It's about corporate integrity." Marcus placed the file on the central table. The directors began flipping through the pages, their faces pale. Richard laughed loudly, but his laugh sounded fake. A hoax! A fake report from a lowly analyst! Samantha, who was sitting in the back, stood up with a loud voice. "I personally downloaded that email from the company server. It's authentic." All eyes were now on Richard. His face turned red, then pale. He tried to speak, but his voice choked. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "You think you can take me down? I built Novacor from scratch. I made you all rich. Without me, this company would have died years ago." Marcus took a step forward, his voice piercing. "It's because of you that Novacor almost died today." The words echoed in the room. One of the senior directors stood up, his voice heavy. "Richard, with all this evidence, I can no longer defend you. We must hold a vote." Richard fell silent. For the first time, the king looked small, fragile, cornered. The vote proceeded. One by one, the directors raised their hands. The result was clear. The majority voted to suspend Richard and hand the case over to an external audit team. Richard slumped in his chair, his face ashen. "You are traitors, all traitors." Security officers entered, escorting the CEO from the room. As the door closed, everyone fell silent. Only heavy breathing could be heard. Marcus stared at the empty chair at the head of the table. The chair that had once been filled with arrogance was now silent, cold, and ownerless. A few weeks later, the atmosphere at Novacor changed completely. An external audit confirmed that Richard had indeed abused his power. The news exploded in the media. The once respected name became a symbol of greed. David was named interim CEO. Samantha was promoted to head of the market research team, and Marcus, the young analyst who had once been looked down upon, sat in the large boardroom as the company's chief strategic advisor. But despite his rise, he remained humble. He knew the struggle wasn't over, but he had proven something. Even a small voice, when driven by truth, can shake the towers of power. That night, he stood by his office window, gazing out at the glittering Chicago skyline. He whispered to himself, "I don't want to be king. I just want to be the keeper of the flame, a small flame that lights the way for everyone." And with that, the story of the power struggle at Novacor ended. But the legend of the young analyst who dared to challenge the CEO will always whisper in the halls, a reminder that truth may be quiet, but it never dies.